The amber glow of the desk lamp cast long shadows across Detective Marcus Blackwood's study as the telephone's shrill ring pierced the October evening silence. But what chilled him wasn't the autumn wind rattling the windows. It was the tremor in Inspector Crawford's voice when he answered, "Blackwood, I need you here immediately." Something's happened at the Whitmore Gallery that defies explanation. Eleanor Hayes looked up from her typewriter, her fingers frozen above the keys. In the 3 years she'd worked as Blackwood's assistant, she'd never heard such urgency in the inspector's tone filtering through the receiver. The detective's weathered face grew pale as he listened, his gray eyes narrowing with each word. A locked room murder? Blackwood's voice carried a mixture of intrigue and disbelief. "Crawford, are you absolutely certain? No windows, no other exits?" Eleanor rose from her chair, her heart quickening. She'd read about such cases in detective novels, but in reality, the very notion seemed impossible. Yet here was Inspector Crawford, a man of 30 years' experience, claiming exactly that had occurred in Manhattan's most exclusive art gallery. "The victim is Victoria Ashford," Crawford continued, his voice barely audible through the static. "The gallery owner's daughter, found dead in the private viewing room at midnight, door locked from the inside, key still in the victim's purse. Security guards swear nobody entered or left after the evening auction ended." Blackwood's grip tightened on the receiver. Victoria Ashford, he remembered her from the society pages. 28 years old, beautiful, heir to the Ashford fortune built on rare art collections. What could have driven someone to murder her in such an elaborate fashion? Any witnesses to her final hours? Blackwood asked, already reaching for his coat. "That's where it gets stranger," Crawford replied. 5 people remained in the gallery after closing. All claim they never saw her enter that room. Yet somehow, she ended up dead inside a space that had been empty just hours before. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. 5 people, 1 victim, and an impossible crime. She grabbed her notebook and pen, knowing this case would test every skill she'd developed working alongside the renowned detective. The thrill of a new mystery mixed with an unsettling dread something about this felt different from their usual cases. "We'll be there within the hour," Blackwood promised, hanging up the phone. He turned to Eleanor, his expression grave. "Pack everything we might need for an extended investigation. Something tells me the Whitmore Gallery is hiding secrets darker than anyone realizes." Asterisk as they prepared to leave. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a carefully constructed trap. The autumn night seemed to whisper warnings, but the detective's determination was infectious. Whatever awaited them at the gallery, she knew they would face it together. The taxi ride through Manhattan's dimly lit streets felt like a journey into the unknown. Street lamps flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent intent. Eleanor found herself studying her companion's profile, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed against his knee, telltale signs that Detective Blackwood sensed something sinister about this case. "Tell me, Eleanor," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "In your experience, what drives someone to create such an elaborate murder scene?" A locked room isn't just about hiding evidence, it's about making a statement. Eleanor considered the question carefully. Perhaps the killer wanted to demonstrate their superiority, to prove they could commit the perfect crime? Or, Blackwood replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, they wanted to ensure we'd be called in to investigate. Think about it, Crawford specifically requested my assistance. Someone knew exactly which buttons to push to get us involved. The taxi turned onto 5th Avenue, and Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. Were they rushing toward justice or walking into a predator's web? The Whitmore Gallery loomed ahead, its elegant facade now shrouded in police tape and flashing emergency lights. Something evil had taken residence in that building, and she could feel its presence even from the street. Detective Blackwood paid the driver and stepped onto the sidewalk, his keen eyes already scanning the scene. Remember, Eleanor, in cases like this, everyone is a suspect until proven otherwise. The most innocent-seeming person often harbors the darkest secrets. The galleries. Front entrance buzzed with activity as forensics teams moved in and out like worker ants. Inspector Crawford emerged from the shadows, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of strain. His steel gray hair appeared disheveled, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd been wrestling with this puzzle for hours. "Blackwood, thank God you're here," Crawford said, extending a firm handshake. "This case has my entire team baffled. We've never encountered anything quite like it." Eleanor introduced herself to the inspector, noting how his weathered hands trembled slightly, a detail that sent another wave of unease through her chest. If this case had rattled a veteran like Crawford, what horrors awaited them inside? "Show us the scene," Blackwood requested, his voice carrying the authority that had made him legendary among New York's law enforcement. They entered the gallery through the main doors, passing beneath crystal chandeliers that cast prismatic light across marble floors. Despite the late hour, the building felt alive with tension, as if the very walls had absorbed the trauma of the evening's events. Eleanor's footsteps echoed unnaturally in the vast space, each sound seeming to carry whispered secrets. "The auction ended at 10:30, Crawford began, consulting his notebook as they walked. Victoria Ashford was seen speaking with several guests near the main exhibition area. According to witnesses, she appeared agitated about something, but nobody heard the specific conversation. Eleanor documented every detail, her pen scratching furiously across the paper. Already, questions were forming in her mind. What had agitated Victoria? Who had she been speaking with? And most crucially, how did she end up dead in a room that should have been impossible to enter or exit? The gallery's interior consisted of several interconnected rooms, each showcasing different periods and styles of artwork. Paintings worth millions of dollars gazed down at them from the walls, their subjects seeming to watch their progress with knowing eyes. Eleanor shuddered, feeling as though she were walking through a museum of witnesses who could never speak. "Here's where it gets interesting," Crawford said, stopping before a heavy oak door marked private viewing room. This door was locked when we arrived. Victoria's body was found inside, and the key was still in her personal effects. No other way in or out. The room has no windows, no ventilation shafts large enough for a person, nothing. Blackwood examined the doorframe with his magnifying glass, searching for any signs of tampering. Eleanor watched his methodical approach, noting how he paid attention to details that others might overlook. This was why his reputation preceded him. No clue was too small, no detail too insignificant. "The lock mechanism appears untouched," he murmured, more to himself than to his companions. "No scratches, no signs of picking. Either someone had a second key or ... double quotes." He paused, his brow furrowing in concentration. "Or what?" Crawford asked, leaning forward eagerly, asterisk. "Or we're dealing with someone far more clever than the average criminal?" Blackwood replied ominously. "Someone who understands that the most effective magic trick isn't about what you show people. It's about what you convince them they've seen." Eleanor felt a cold finger traced down her spine. Magic trick? Was the detective suggesting this was some kind of elaborate illusion? But how could murder be an illusion when a real person lay dead? They entered the viewing room, and Eleanor immediately understood why this case had disturbed even seasoned investigators. The space was small and windowless, designed for intimate examinations of valuable artwork. Ornate chairs were arranged in a semicircle facing a single easel, which held a painting covered by a dark cloth. Victoria Ashford's body had been removed, but the chalk outline remained, telling its own silent story. She had been found seated in the central chair, facing the covered painting with no visible signs of violence. Eleanor studied the outline, noting the peaceful position, almost as if Victoria had simply fallen asleep while viewing art. What killed her? Eleanor asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. That's another mystery, Crawford replied grimly. Initial examination showed no obvious cause of death. No wounds, no signs of poisoning, nothing. It's as if she simply stopped living. The three investigators stood in silence, each grappling with the impossibility of the situation. A woman had died in a locked room with no apparent cause, no weapon, and no feasible way for a killer to escape. Eleanor felt the weight of the mystery pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Detective Blackwood approached the covered easel, his hand hovering near the cloth. Has anyone looked at this painting? We were waiting for you, Crawford admitted. Something about this whole scene felt ... staged. We didn't want to disturb anything until you could examine it firsthand. Eleanor held her breath as Blackwood grasped the corner of the dark cloth. With one smooth motion, he pulled it away, revealing the painting beneath. All three investigators gasped in unison. The artwork showed a woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to Victoria Ashford, seated in the exact same chair where her body had been found. But this painted figure's eyes held a terror that spoke of impending doom. Her mouth opened in a silent scream that seemed to echo through the small room. My God, Crawford whispered. It's like she was posing for her own death portrait. Eleanor stared at the painting, transfixed by its horrifying beauty. The artist had captured something beyond mere physical likeness. There was a sense of fate, of inevitability that made her skin crawl. Whoever had painted this had known exactly what was going to happen in this room. Check the signature, Blackwood ordered, his voice tight with tension. Eleanor leaned closer, squinting at the bottom right corner of the canvas. There, in elegant script, were the initials VA and a date from just 3 days ago. Victoria Ashford painted her own death scene. She breathed, the words sounding impossible even as she spoke them. The detective's gray eyes darkened. Or someone wanted us to think she did. Either way, we're dealing with a mind capable of orchestrating something far more complex than a simple murder. This is psychological warfare disguised as art. As they stood there, staring at the prophetic painting, Eleanor realized they weren't just investigating a crime, they were unraveling a puzzle designed specifically for Detective Marcus Blackwood. Someone had created this elaborate scenario knowing exactly how the famous detective would respond, what questions he would ask, what conclusions he might draw. The thought was terrifying. If someone could predict Blackwood's methods so precisely, what else had they planned? What other surprises awaited them in this gallery of secrets? We need to interview the 5 people who remained after the auction, Blackwood said finally, pulling himself away from the mesmerizing painting. But first, I want a complete history of this gallery, its owners, and anyone with access to this room. Someone orchestrated this performance, and they're not finished yet? Crawford nodded grimly. I've got all 5 potential witnesses secured in the main exhibition hall. They've been waiting for hours, and frankly, they're getting restless. Each one claims to know nothing about Victoria's death, but ... double quotes. But one of them is lying, Blackwood finished. And that person is either our killer or knows exactly who is. The question is, how do we identify them when they've had hours to perfect their story? Eleanor felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with dread. The hunt was beginning, and somewhere in this gallery, a murderer was waiting to match wits with the famous detective. But this wasn't just any criminal, this was someone who had studied Blackwood's methods, someone who had prepared for this encounter like a chess master planning their ultimate game. As they prepared to leave the viewing room, Eleanor took one last look at the painting. Victoria Ashford's terrified eyes seemed to follow her, and she could swear she heard a whispered warning carried on the gallery's still air. Trust no one. Everyone here has blood on their hands. The door closed behind them with a sound like a coffin lid sealing shut, and Eleanor knew that before this night ended, more secrets would be revealed, and perhaps more lives would be lost. The Whitmore Gallery had become a stage, and they were all unwitting actors in a drama scripted by a master of death, asterisk. The main exhibition hall of the Whitmore Gallery had been transformed into an impromptu interrogation chamber. 5 individuals sat scattered across expensive leather chairs, their faces illuminated by the harsh glare of police spotlights. Each maintained their own island of anxiety in the vast space, avoiding eye contact with their fellow suspects as if guilt itself might be contagious. Detective Blackwood studied them from the shadows before making his entrance, a technique that had served him well over 2 decades of criminal investigation. People revealed more about themselves when they believed they were unobserved. A nervous tick, a guilty glance, the way someone held their body when they thought no one was watching. Eleanor positioned herself near the gallery's rear wall, her notebook ready. She'd learned to watch not just the person being questioned, but the reactions of everyone else in the room. Often, the most telling moments came from those who weren't speaking, whose faces betrayed secrets they desperately wanted to hide. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood announced, stepping into the light with theatrical precision. "I am Detective Marcus Blackwood, and I've been called in to investigate Miss Victoria Ashford's tragic death. I understand you've all been waiting patiently, and I apologize for the delay. However, I'm sure you'll appreciate that thoroughness is essential when dealing with such unusual circumstances." The 5 suspects turned toward him with varying degrees of apprehension. Eleanor noted their reactions carefully. 2 seemed genuinely relieved that questioning would finally begin. 2 appeared nervous about what might be uncovered, and one she couldn't quite identify which radiated a cold confidence that sent chills down her spine. Inspector Crawford approached the first suspect, consulting his notes. "This is Dr. Harrison Thorne, age 52, curator of Renaissance art. He organized tonight's auction and was responsible for the private viewing arrangements." Dr. Thorne rose from his chair, a distinguished man with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him an academic air. His hands, Eleanor noticed, showed faint stains that could have been paint or something far more sinister. "Dr. Thorne," Blackwood began, his voice carrying the authority that had made hardened criminals confess their darkest secrets. "Tell me about your relationship with Victoria Ashford." "Professional, primarily," Thorne replied, though his voice carried an undertone that suggested otherwise. "Victoria had strong opinions about how the gallery should be managed. She felt some of her father's collection was being undervalued." Eleanor documented this carefully. Family disputes over money and art were classic motives for murder, especially in circles where reputation meant everything. But something in Thorne's manner suggested deeper complications, perhaps. Romantic entanglements that had gone wrong. "You were seen arguing with Miss Ashford earlier this evening," Crawford interjected. "Care to explain what that was about?" Thorne's composure slipped momentarily, a flash of anger crossing his features before he regained control. "Victoria discovered that I'd been reconsidering the authentication of several pieces in tonight's auction. She accused me of deliberately sabotaging sales to make her father look incompetent. And were you?" Blackwood asked, his gray eyes boring into the curator's soul. The pause lasted too long. Some of the attributions were questionable. "I had a professional obligation to—" "That's not what I asked," Blackwood interrupted sharply. "Were you deliberately sabotaging the auction?" Eleanor watched the other suspects during this exchange. A woman with striking red hair leaned forward slightly, her interest clearly piqued. An elderly gentleman in an expensive suit shifted uncomfortably, while a younger man near the windows appeared to be memorizing every word. The 5th suspect, a middle-aged woman in black, remained perfectly still, as if she'd turned to stone. "Perhaps," Thorne admitted finally, "but not for the reasons you might think." Victoria's father, Charles Ashford, has been selling forgeries for years. I couldn't remain silent about it any longer, regardless of the personal cost. This revelation sent ripples through the room. Eleanor saw glances exchanged between the other suspects, some surprised, others knowing. Charles Ashford's reputation was legendary in art circles, but if his own curator was accusing him of fraud, a serious accusation, Blackwood observed. One that might ruin more than just Charles Ashford's reputation. His daughter stood to inherit a collection that could be worthless if your claims were true. Exactly, Thorne exclaimed, then seemed to realize how damaging his enthusiasm might sound. I mean, Victoria had a right to know the truth about her inheritance. Eleanor made a note. Thorne benefits from discrediting Ashford collection career advancement. But even as she wrote, something bothered her about the curator's story. His anger seemed genuine, but there were gaps in his narrative that suggested hidden motives. Blackwood moved to the second suspect, a woman whose vibrant red hair seemed to glow under the harsh lights. "And you are?" "Sophia Blackwell," she replied with a slight southern accent. "I'm an art dealer from Charleston. I was here tonight representing several private collectors interested in acquiring pieces from the Ashford collection. Eleanor studied Sophia's appearance expensive jewelry, designer clothing, the kind of polished perfection that spoke of serious money. But there was something predatory in her green eyes, a hunger that suggested she was willing to do whatever necessary to close a deal. Did you know Victoria personally?" Blackwood inquired. Sophia's laugh carried no warmth. "Honey, Victoria Ashford and I had what you might call a complicated history. We both dated the same man a few years back, Richard Monterey. Things got messy." "Define messy," Crawford prompted, his pen poised over his notepad. "Victoria tried to destroy my reputation in art circles," Sophia replied, her facade of southern charm slipping to reveal steel underneath. "She spread rumors that I was selling fakes, that I couldn't be trusted. Nearly ruined my business. Eleanor glanced at Dr. Thorne, noting how his face had gone pale at the mention of Richard Monterey. Another connection, another potential motive. The web of relationships was becoming increasingly complex. "And how did you respond to these accusations?" Blackwood asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "I fought back," Sophia said simply. "I had my lawyers investigate Victoria's own dealings. Turned out Miss Perfect had some secrets of her own, including a gambling problem that had her deeply in debt to some very unpleasant people." The elderly gentleman in the expensive suit suddenly stood up, his face flushed with anger. "That's enough. I won't have you speaking ill of Victoria when she can't defend herself." Blackwood turned his attention to this new speaker, his eyebrows raised in interest. "And you are?" "James Morrison, Victoria's godfather and financial advisor," the man replied, his voice shaking with emotion. "I've known that girl since she was born, and I won't tolerate these vicious lies about gambling debts." Eleanor watched the interplay between Morrison and Sophia, noting the genuine grief in the older man's eyes contrasted with the cold satisfaction in the art dealer's expression. But was Morrison's defense of Victoria based on love or fear that his own secrets might be exposed? "Mr. Morrison," Blackwood continued gently, "when did you last speak with Victoria?" "This afternoon," Morrison admitted reluctantly. "She called me in a panic about something. Said she'd discovered something terrible and needed my help to fix it before tonight's auction." "Did she specify what she'd discovered?" Morrison's hesitation spoke volumes. "She mentioned finding some old documents in her father's study, papers that could ruin the family reputation if they became public." Eleanor felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting. Victoria had discovered something damaging about her family's art business, the same business that Dr. Thorne was already questioning. But what kind of documents could be so dangerous that someone would kill to keep them secret? The fourth suspect, a young man who'd been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. Those documents might have mentioned me. All eyes turned to him, a handsome man in his early 30s with the kind of brooding intensity that belonged in romantic novels. His dark hair was disheveled, his expensive clothes wrinkled, as if he'd been running his hands through his hair for hours. I'm David Chen, Victoria's former fiancé, he said, the words seeming to cause him physical pain. We broke up 3 months ago, but Victoria had been trying to get me back. She said she had information that could destroy my family's import business if I didn't reconsider our relationship. Eleanor noted the shocked reactions from the other suspects. Even in this group of people with complicated relationships to the victim, David's revelation stood out as particularly damning. Blackmail was certainly a motive for murder. What kind of information? Blackwood pressed, David's hands clenched into fists. My family's business occasionally imports items that aren't properly documented through customs. Nothing dangerous, just valuable pieces that collectors prefer to acquire discreetly. Victoria found shipping records that could expose her clients. So she was blackmailing you? Crawford stated bluntly. She called it encouraging reconciliation, David replied bitterly. But yes, she was threatening to destroy my family unless I married her. Eleanor watched the fifth and final suspect during this exchange, the woman in black who had remained perfectly still. There was something unsettling about her composure, as if she were watching a play rather than participating in a murder investigation. Blackwood approached this last woman, his instincts clearly telling him that she was the most dangerous person in the room. And you are? Margaret Whitmore, she replied in a voice devoid of emotion. I own this gallery. Victoria was my business partner and, until recently, someone I considered a dear friend. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Eleanor felt her heart rate increase. There was something deeply wrong about Margaret Whitmore's affect. She spoke of friendship and death in the same tone one might use to discuss the weather. What changed your friendship? Blackwood asked, his voice carefully neutral. Victoria discovered that I've been using the gallery to launder money for certain clients who prefer anonymity in their financial affairs, Margaret replied with chilling matter-of-factness. She demanded I stop immediately, or she would expose everything to the authorities. Eleanor's pen froze above her notebook. Money laundering was a federal crime, one that could result in decades in prison. Margaret Whitmore had just confessed to a motive that made all the others pale by comparison. That must have put you in a difficult position, Blackwood observed. Indeed, Margaret agreed. My clients are not the sort of people who accept exposure gracefully. If Victoria had gone to the police, I would have been dead within a week. So you see, Detective, I had every reason to kill her. The confession hung in the air like poison gas. Eleanor looked around the room, noting how the other suspects had instinctively moved away from Margaret, as if her guilt might contaminate them. But something about the woman's ready admission bothered her. It was almost too convenient, too neat. Blackwood clearly shared her suspicions. Mrs. Whitmore, for someone who just confessed to murder, you seem remarkably calm. I didn't say I killed her, Margaret replied with the ghost of a smile. I said I had every reason to. There's a significant difference, Detective. I may be a criminal, but I'm not stupid enough to murder someone in my own gallery and then wait around to be arrested. Eleanor felt the investigation taking a sharp turn. 5 suspects, 5 motives, and now one quasi-confession that raised more questions than it answered. Each person in this room had reason to want Victoria Ashford dead, but the locked room mystery remained unsolved. Ladies and gentlemen, Blackwood announced, I want each of you to think very carefully about your movements tonight between 10:30 and midnight. One of you is lying about your whereabouts, and that person is either our killer or knows who is. Eleanor Watch their faces as the detective spoke. Dr. Thorne looked genuinely confused, as if he were trying to reconstruct a timeline that made no sense. Sophia Blackwell appeared calculating, her eyes darting between the other suspects as if weighing her options. James Morrison seemed lost in grief, while David Chen radiated barely contained anger. Only Margaret Whitmore remained unchanged, her expression as blank as a death mask. Inspector Crawford will take your detailed statements, Blackwood continued. Miss Hayes and I will be examining the rest of the gallery for additional evidence. I suggest you use this time to remember anything you might have forgotten. Lies have a way of unraveling at the worst possible moments. As they left the suspects under Crawford's supervision, Eleanor felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. They had 5 people with compelling motives, but the locked room mystery remained as baffling as ever. How had the killer entered and escaped from a room with only one door? What's your assessment? Blackwood asked as they walked toward the gallery's other exhibition spaces. They're all hiding something, Eleanor replied. But Margaret Whitmore bothers me the most. Her confession felt rehearsed, as if she'd been planning to tell us about the money laundering all along. Excellent observation, Blackwood said approvingly. Someone who launders money for dangerous clients wouldn't casually confess to a detective unless they had a very good reason. Either she's protecting someone else, or she's trying to direct our attention away from the real crime. They entered a smaller exhibition room filled with sculptures and glass cases containing precious artifacts. Eleanor felt the weight of centuries pressing down on the objects that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations that had outlasted their creators and would outlast everyone currently alive. The question remains, Blackwood mused, examining a medieval tapestry with his magnifying glass. How did someone commit murder in a locked room? And more importantly, why go to such elaborate lengths to create an impossible crime? Eleanor studied a glass case containing ancient coins, their surfaces reflecting the overhead lights like tiny mirrors. Perhaps the locked room wasn't meant to hide the killer's identity. Perhaps it was meant to ensure we'd be called in to investigate. Blackwood paused in his examination, his gray eyes meeting hers across the room. You think this entire scenario was designed specifically for us? Think about it, Eleanor continued, warming to her theory. Inspector Crawford specifically requested your help. The crime is elaborate enough to intrigue you, but seemingly impossible enough to challenge your methods. Even the painting in the viewing room, it's like someone was painting a portrait of their perfect crime. The detective's expression grew darker. If you're right, then we're not investigating a murder. We're participating in a performance. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to create a puzzle specifically designed to test my abilities. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the gallery's temperature. But why? What does the killer gain by challenging you directly? That, Blackwood replied grimly, is what we need to discover before they decide the performance requires an encore. As they continued their examination of the gallery, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not just by the suspects in the main hall, but by unseen eyes that tracked their every movement. The Whitmore Gallery had become a stage, and somewhere in the shadows, the real orchestrator of this deadly drama was waiting to see if the famous detective could solve the puzzle they'd so carefully constructed. But what would happen if he failed? And more terrifyingly, what would happen if he succeeded? Detective Blackwood's examination of the gallery's secondary rooms revealed more than Eleanor had anticipated. Hidden behind Renaissance paintings and classical sculptures lay a network of secrets that transformed their understanding of the case entirely. The Whitmore Gallery wasn't just an art venue, it was the epicenter of a criminal enterprise that reached into the highest levels of society. In Margaret Whitmore's private office, concealed behind a false wall panel, They discovered a sophisticated computer system with encrypted files detailing transactions worth millions of dollars. Eleanor's fingers flew across her notebook as Blackwood called out information from the screen. "Look at this," he said, his voice tight with concentration. "Monthly payments to someone identified only as the collector amounts that dwarf anything this gallery could legitimately generate." Eleanor peered over his shoulder at the monitor. The financial records painted a picture of an operation that used art sales as a front for something far more sinister. These dates correspond with major auctions over the past 2 years. Someone's been using the gallery's legitimate business to hide massive money transfers. But notice this anomaly. Blackwood pointed to a series of entries from the past month. The payments to the collectors stopped 3 weeks ago, right around the time Victoria began asking questions about the gallery's finances. The implications were staggering. If Victoria had discovered this financial trail, she hadn't just stumbled upon Margaret's money laundering operation she'd uncovered, something that could bring down a network of criminals who dealt in sums that made the Ashford collection look like pocket change. Eleanor studied the dates more carefully. "Detective, look at this entry from last week. A withdrawal of $500,000, labeled Final Payment Problem Resolution. That's just 2 days before Victoria's death." Blackwood's gray eyes darkened. Someone paid $500,000 to resolve the problem of Victoria Ashford. But who received that payment, and more importantly, who authorized it? Their investigation was interrupted by Crawford's voice echoing through the gallery's halls. "Blackwood, you need to see this immediately." They rushed back toward the main exhibition area, Eleanor's heart racing with anticipation. Crawford met them halfway, his face pale with shock. "We've found another body," he announced grimly. "Charles Ashford, Victoria's father. Security found him in his study at the family estate 20 minutes ago." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Victoria's father dead? The case had just exploded beyond their comprehension. This wasn't a single murder anymore. It was a systematic elimination of the Ashford family. How? Blackwood demanded. "Apparent heart attack," Crawford replied. "But given tonight's circumstances, I'm not inclined to believe in coincidences. I've got forensics teams on the way, but I wanted to inform you immediately." Eleanor's mind raced through the implications. Charles Ashford's death eliminated the one person who might have explained the documents Victoria had discovered. It also meant that someone was cleaning up loose ends with ruthless efficiency. "The timing is too convenient," Blackwood observed. "Someone knew we'd eventually trace the gallery's financial irregularities back to Charles Ashford. His death ensures that particular line of investigation dies with him." They returned to the main hall where the 5 suspects remained under police supervision. Eleanor studied their faces carefully, looking for any sign that one of them had expected this development. Most appeared genuinely shocked by the news of Charles Ashford's death, but one face showed no surprise at all. Margaret Whitmore sat motionless in her chair, her expression unchanged by Crawford's announcement. Either she possessed inhuman emotional control, or she'd known about Charles Ashford's death before the inspector informed them. "Mrs. Whitmore," Blackwood addressed her directly, "you don't seem surprised by this news." "I've learned not to be surprised by death, Detective," she replied with chilling composure. "In my line of work, people who become inconvenient have a tendency to disappear." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. Margaret's words carried an unmistakable threat, a warning that the same fate could befall anyone who dug too deep into her affairs. "Your line of work being money laundering?" Blackwood pressed. "Among other things," Margaret confirmed. "You see, Detective, the Whitmore Gallery serves clients who require absolute discretion. Collectors who prefer their acquisitions remain anonymous. Investors who appreciate clean financial transactions. Individuals whose wealth requires creative accounting." Dr. Thorne suddenly stood up, his academic composure finally cracking. My God, Margaret, what have you gotten us all involved in? Victoria is dead. Charles is dead. How many more people have to die before this ends? Margaret's cold gaze fixed on the curator. That depends entirely on how cooperative everyone remains, Harrison. Some secrets are worth killing for, Eleanor noted the exchange with growing alarm. Dr. Thorne clearly knew more about the gallery's criminal activities than he'd initially admitted. His authentication work hadn't just been about art, it had been about providing legitimate cover for illegal transactions. Dr. Thorne, Blackwood said sharply, I suggest you tell us everything you know about this operation before your name joins the casualty list. The curator's hands shook as he removed his wire-rimmed spectacles and cleaned them nervously. I thought it was just about authentication at first. Margaret asked me to verify certain pieces without documenting the full provenance. She said her clients valued privacy above bureaucracy. When did you realize it was more than privacy? Eleanor asked gently. 3 months ago, Thorne admitted. I discovered that some of the pieces I'd authenticated were reported stolen from museums across Europe. When I confronted Margaret, she made it clear that my continued health depended on my continued cooperation. Sophia. Blackwell laughed bitterly from across the room. Welcome to Margaret's world, honey. Once she has her hooks in you, there's no getting out alive. Eleanor turned her attention to the art dealer. You were involved in this operation too? I supplied clients, Sophia replied with resignation. Private collectors who didn't ask too many questions about provenance. Margaret paid me very well to connect her with people who had more money than morals. James Morrison's face had turned ashen during these revelations. Victoria. She discovered all of this, didn't she? That's what she was trying to tell me. She'd found evidence of the stolen art, the money laundering, everything. And that's why she had to die, David Chen said quietly. Victoria wasn't just threatening to expose individual crimes, she was about to bring down an entire network. Eleanor watched Margaret's reaction to these admissions. The gallery owner remained perfectly still, but there was something predatory in her stillness, like a spider waiting for flies to entangle themselves further in her web. You're all missing the most important question, Margaret said finally. If I killed Victoria to protect this operation, how did I manage to commit murder in a locked room with no other exits? It was a challenge thrown directly at Blackwood, and Eleanor could see the detective's mind racing to solve the mechanical puzzle, even as the larger conspiracy became clear. The locked room mystery remained the key to identifying Victoria's killer. Blackwood began pacing, his eyes fixed on some internal calculation. The locked room wasn't the real mystery, he said suddenly. It was misdirection designed to make us focus on the impossible rather than the obvious. What do you mean? Crawford asked. Victoria Ashford wasn't killed in that viewing room, Blackwood announced. She was already dead when her body was placed there. The locked room was simply a stage designed to confuse the investigation. Eleanor felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. But the key was in her purse ... planted there, Blackwood confirmed, along with everything else designed to make us believe she died in that room. The real question isn't how the killer escaped from a locked room, it's where Victoria actually died, and how her body was transported to the viewing room without being seen. Margaret's composure finally cracked, a flash of anger crossing her features before she regained control. Clever detective. But even if you're right, you still can't prove who killed her or how it was accomplished, can I? Blackwood replied with a thin smile. Eleanor, do you remember what bothered you about the painting in the viewing room? Eleanor consulted her notes, her heart racing as she realized where the detective's reasoning was leading. The signature VA dated just 3 days ago, but Victoria couldn't have painted her own death scene. Exactly. Someone else painted that portrait. Someone who knew exactly how Victoria would be positioned when her body was discovered. Someone who had access to this gallery's security systems. knowledge of its layout, and the authority to move freely through the building after hours. Eleanor saw Blackwood's fingers twitch slightly toward his coat pocket. The detective was preparing to make his move, but Crawford's weapon remained trained on his chest with unwavering precision. "You made one crucial mistake," Blackwood said suddenly, his voice carrying absolute confidence. Crawford's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I don't make mistakes, Detective. You assumed I came here alone," Blackwood replied with a slight smile. Eleanor's heart leaped as she understood. The detective had called for backup before entering the gallery backup that Crawford, in his arrogance, had dismissed or forgotten about in his rush to reveal his master plan. "You're bluffing," Crawford snarled, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "Am I?" Blackwood asked calmly. "FBI Special Agent Sarah Martinez has been monitoring this investigation since we discovered the money laundering evidence. She's been positioned outside this gallery for the past hour, waiting for my signal." Crawford's gun hand began to tremble with rage. "Even if that's true, you'll be dead before any backup arrives." "Perhaps," Blackwood agreed. "But my death will only confirm everything Agent Martinez has already documented. Your network, your clients, your methods, it's all been recorded and transmitted to federal headquarters." Eleanor realized that Blackwood was buying time, using Crawford's ego against him. The corrupt inspector needed to know how much his enemies had discovered, and that need for information was overriding his instinct to shoot first and ask questions later. "You're lying," Crawford screamed, his professional composure finally cracking completely. "I've monitored all law enforcement communications. There's no FBI involvement." "Check your coat pocket," Blackwood suggested quietly. Crawford's free hand moved instinctively toward his jacket, and in that moment of distraction, Blackwood struck. The detective's emergency flare flew through the air, striking Crawford's gun hand just as brilliant white light flooded the gallery. Eleanor threw herself behind a marble statue as ominous gunshots echoed through the space. The 5 suspects scattered in different directions, their terrified shouts mixing with the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. Through the chaos, Eleanor saw Blackwood tackle Crawford to the ground, the 2 men struggling desperately for control of the weapon. The corrupt inspector was younger and stronger, but the detective fought with the desperation of a man who knew that losing meant death for everyone in the gallery. Margaret Whitmore suddenly appeared beside Eleanor, her face illuminated by the dying flare. "There's a panic button behind the reception desk," she whispered urgently. "It connects directly to police headquarters." Eleanor didn't hesitate. She sprinted across the gallery floor, dodging falling debris as Crawford and Blackwood's fight sent sculptures crashing to the ground. Her fingers found the hidden panic button just as another gunshot rang out. The sudden silence that followed was more terrifying than the chaos had been. Eleanor peered around the reception desk to see Detective Blackwood, standing over Crawford's motionless form, the inspector's weapon now in the detective's steady hands. Crawford lay unconscious, blood seeping from a head wound where he'd struck a marble pedestal during their struggle. "It's over," Blackwood announced quietly, his voice carrying across the devastated gallery. Sirens wailed in the distance reel. Police officers responding to the panic button, officers who hadn't been corrupted by Crawford's influence. Eleanor felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she realized they had survived the most dangerous case of their careers. As FBI agents and legitimate police officers flooded into the gallery, Eleanor helped document the final pieces of evidence that would bring down Crawford's criminal network. The corrupt inspector had been right about one thing: his organization had tentacles reaching into the highest levels of society. But his arrogance had also been his downfall, leading him to reveal details that would help authorities unravel decades of criminal activity. Victoria Ashford's death would not be in vain. Her discovery of the truth had set in motion events that would see justice served. even though she hadn't lived to witness it herself. 2 hours later, as Crawford was loaded into an ambulance under heavy guard, Detective Blackwood stood beside Eleanor on the gallery steps. The autumn dawn was breaking over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "How did you know to call for FBI backup?" Eleanor asked. Blackwood's gray eyes twinkled with exhausted humor. "I didn't. Agent Martinez was a complete fabrication, a bluff designed to make Crawford reveal more information than he intended." Eleanor stared at him in amazement. "You risked all our lives on a bluff?" "Sometimes," Blackwood replied thoughtfully, "the truth is less important than what people believe to be true." Crawford's guilt made him paranoid, and paranoid people make mistakes. As they watched the sun rise over New York City, Eleanor reflected on the lessons of the Whitmore gallery case. Evil could hide behind badges and titles. Trusted figures could harbor the darkest secrets. And sometimes the most elaborate mysteries had surprisingly simple solutions. But she had also learned that courage and intelligence could triumph over corruption and greed, that justice could prevail even in the darkest circumstances, and that the partnership between Detective Marcus Blackwood and herself was strong enough to survive the most dangerous investigations. The Whitmore Gallery mystery was closed, but Eleanor knew that their next case was already waiting somewhere in the vast city below, and when it came, they would be ready to face it together.